have Eduardo Montero as our next speaker. So Eduardo is an assistant professor at the Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, and he's also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Eduardo is an economist interested in development economics, political economy, and economic history. And in particular, his research focuses on how institutions and cultural norms affect development policy, especially in Central America and Central Africa. And so today, Eduardo will present us a paper which is entitled, and you can see it on your screen, Religious Festivals and Economic Development, Evidence from Catholic Sunday Festivals in Mexico. And this is a joint paper with Dean Young. So dear Eduardo, thank you again very much for accepting our invitation from Costa Rica, where you currently are. You have, again, 1 hour in total with about 10 to 15 minutes dedicated to questions in the end. And so if you do not have any co-author in the chat, I might interrupt you for clarification questions during the talk, if you are fine with this. Thank you so much again.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Thank you guys for the invitation, organizing this great conference. And thank you to Eliana, Salim, and Sam for a really great presentation that I think there's a lot of insights that feed into this one too, on the persistence of cultural traits and how that affects economic development. So today I'm going to be talking about this joint work with Dean Yang on religious festivals and economic development. And so the focus here is really on understanding these religious festivals, which are a very common trait of cultures worldwide. People around the world celebrate them, and they also devote substantial resources to celebrating them. In particular, in developing countries, as highlighted by Banerjee and Duflo in their book Poor Economics, even if individuals are making under $2 a day in income, they still spend substantial resources on these religious festivals to celebrate them. There's been a bit of an argument here about how these religious festivals affect long-run economic development, and why do societies continue to have them, and how does this matter for economic policies today? And so the literature has kind of highlighted that these two trade-offs when deciding festival characteristics. In particular, costly festivals might induce this trade-off. So festivals might be beneficial, actually, if they lead to more social capital, and that then ultimately leads to more economic development. And if festivals are particularly costly, they might make societies feel even closer to each other, in the sense that they're a good form of social signaling. On the other side, though, festivals may be somewhat detrimental to economic development if they crowd out other investments, right? If people are liquidity constrained and investments are time sensitive, they could have this sort of detrimental effect. There's a bit of a trade-off here, and it's unclear kind of what are the implications for long-run development. And of course, as you guys can imagine in this audience, kind of getting at estimates of this question is pretty difficult, especially for long-run development, for a number of reasons. So of course, religious festivals are often not exogenously determined. Their features are not exogenously determined often. But often another thing is that the variation is often at a very large scale. So it affects entire societies at once, making it hard to kind of take advantage of more micro within country variation. So what we do in this paper is we investigate the impact of a particular religious practice that was kind of imposed by Spanish conquerors in Latin America, today focusing on Mexico, as part of Catholicism, which are these patron saint day festivals. And our identification strategy is basically to take advantage of the temporal variation we have here. So the map on the left is showing you the Saint Day Festival across municipalities in Mexico. As you can see, it varies a lot across the calendar year. The second thing we take advantage of is that agricultural seasons in Mexico also vary a lot within country. So here just showing you the maize planting month across municipalities in Mexico, and it varies a lot. And so the idea here is to just compare municipalities that have what we call agriculturally coinciding festivals. So those that coincide with peak planting or harvest periods to those without. It's kind of a proxy for how costly a festival is to society and how does this impact economic development subsequently. And so what do we find here? So first, turning to the first question is, how do these festivals affect development today? What we do is we construct a data set across municipalities of their patron saints, so their identity, and what their festival date is according to the Roman Catholic calendar, and then determine whether they coincide with key planting and harvest periods. And we find that agriculturally coinciding festivals are associated with less economic development, kind of broadly measured. But then we turn to understanding kind of the mechanisms for this. And so we find that these festivals that coincide with peak planting and harvest periods are particularly, associated with lower agricultural productivity. And over the long run, that tends to be associated with less structural transformation. So they're more reliant on agriculture today still. And then finally, I think a natural question then, as economists, is why do these festivals then persist? Well, we show pretty strong evidence that these festivals do lead to higher levels of religiosity and social capital. And so this may help explain why these festivals continue to persist in spite of the kind of negative impacts on economic development. So ultimately, there's this trade-off, and it's not clear which one is best. Kind of, it's good to understand the full picture here. And so what are our contributions? So just broadly, there's this really big literature on the economic consequences of religious practices. Some of the papers here today will be talking about this if we define religious practices very broadly. And specifically focusing on this more recent work, trying to get at some causal identification. So here we're taking a different perspective, kind of exploiting historical variation to look at long-run economic development. Then also this literature on religiosity and social capital. And so we're trying to bring in, how does these cultural practices, how do they affect social capital, and try to understand why these cultural traits tend to persist. And then finally, just understanding the development of Latin America more broadly. There's a lot of great work on this, and Catholicism is very important in Latin America. But these patron saint day festivals haven't been studied a lot, except for anthropologists who really highlighted that they might have these negative implications. Let's talk about the anthropology literature in a little bit. So let me just start off actually first going through a background on these Catholic Saint Day festivals. First, like, what are they, in case you're not familiar with them, and then talking a little bit about how kind of municipalities determine their patron saint. Okay, so what are these Saint Day festivals that I'm going to be talking about? So they're yearly celebrations in Catholic countries, but especially those influenced by Spanish culture. So like Latin America, they're very common. And so in a locality, each kind of locality has a saint or a holy figure who's determined to be their patron. So patron is kind of their protectorate. And so there's hundreds of these figures across the calendar year, and they're set by the hierarchy in the Vatican. So just as an example, today, June 7th, is the Patron Saint Day festival for Saint Isaac, Saint Anthony, and Saint Robert. And so if your name, for example, is like Robert, like my brother is, today is supposed to be a day where you have like good luck. And so according to the Catholic Church, these saints are believed to protect people and their locality and the community. And so you have to kind of worship them so you get this protection, especially on the Patron Saint Day festival. But now in Latin America, it was a bit different too. They were really important because they were part of efforts to convert local populations to Catholicism. And the idea here is that they became very popular because they very naturally commingled Spanish and indigenous religious elements a bit more seamlessly. So they involve things like dancing and songs and celebrations that indigenous groups were able to kind of fit their kind of celebrations into. Whereas something like going to mass inside a church is something that might be a bit different. And so the Spanish in Mexico realized that these were very effective kind of celebrations to introduce Catholicism to indigenous societies. And historically, they lasted over 3 days with a number of events. So a mass on the first night, but then followed by a number of other events like processions, sermons, music, dancing, festivals. And then they ended with a communal meal for the whole village. And historians have talked about that these festivals became one of the most important activities of municipal governments, where villages were spending 75% of their municipal income on these festivals. So much so that actually in the 1790s, the government imposed spending limits, calling the excesses of the festivals superfluous and vicious. And so what this led to is these government spending limits led to this formalization of a pretty distinct social system in Central America and Mexico, which is this mayordomia system or the cargo system, where basically a rotating set of households assume the responsibility for organizing and financing the annual festival. And so becoming a mayordomo or a festival steward brought a lot of respect, but it also involved significant expenditures because these were fixed by custom and agreement. And so households kind of on a given year had to spend a lot of their income. And there's instances where villages were forced to sell parcels of land because they wanted to kind of, be the festival steward for this respect, even at the kind of cost to themselves. And so this mayordomio system still continues today. It's hard to get very good estimates of this, but just as an example, in Santiago Yautepec, each mayordomo or festival steward was spending about $2,000 for the Patron Sainte festival, which is a lot for these rural areas. In 1985, for example, the whole mayordomia, so the whole set of households, just in food was spending $46,000 in today's dollars. So again, considerable amount of money spent on these festivals. Oops, sorry about that. Let me just go back. One sec, sorry about that. Okay, and so the anthropologists really study this mayordomia system, and they even used like very econ words. They said that this behavior is economically irrational behavior, and that makes it interesting for anthropologists to try to understand. And anthropologists really tried to study this because there was this book by Harris that talked about that these imposed festivals by the Spanish were repressive and abusive because they led indigenous people to spend money on things that they didn't really need, and that the money was flowing to the Catholic Church, for example. And they proposed two explanations for why these systems continue. And so the first is this idea that I think fits into cultural economics a lot, which is that serving as a festival steward is a costly signal of religiosity and wealth to the community, and it brings a lot of respect to you. So people do it as a form of social signaling. The other thing too is that, interestingly, this system is a rotating set of households across the year. So it also served as a way of redistributing within the community. So these festivals were also thought to, increase equity in these localities. And so we'll explore this a little bit later on. And so just as an example, these festivals remain quite important to this day. Here you can see one in Sico, Veracruz, and it's pretty massive with a lot of people celebrating the festival. A natural question, of course, though, is how do municipalities determine their patron saint? And so in Mexico and Latin America, unlike in Spain or in Europe, the patron saints were typically established by the Spanish colonizer at the time of a town's funding. And so in Mexico, there were three particular ways that the patron saints were chosen by the Spanish. So the first is military conquest dates. So often they thought it was kind of good luck to honor the saint. To honor the saint associated with the military conquest of that day. The second thing is similarities between the saint and community characteristics. And then the third is similarities between the saint and indigenous god characteristics. Let me get to that in a little bit. And so some oral histories actually describe saints being chosen at quote unquote random. So their saints were actually chosen from a bowl. And the idea here is that saints could then choose the locality rather than having the town choose the saint. And so let me talk about the two most prominent ones first. So military conquest served a particularly important kind of form or way to choose the saints. They would often kind of, the day they established the town, they would just look up on the Vatican calendar what saint is associated with that date and choose it. And the characteristics of the military actions also played a role. So if it was a particularly kind of, brave victory, they would choose a saint associated with bravery, for example. And so this is an example of a festival in more modern times where they still celebrate, part of the conquest as part of the festival. Alternatively, the saints were sometimes chosen based on similarities to already worshipped indigenous gods. So the idea here is like if they had an indigenous god that's associated with things like thrift, they would try to choose a saint associated with thrift as well. They would do something similar, for example, if a town had, salient characteristics such as being associated with good cooking, then they choose a saint associated with good cooking, such as like Puebla. That's actually one of the saints there. The important thing here for our purposes, though, is that the selection is more based on kind of symbolic similarities rather than on the similarity of the dates. We haven't found any instances where they would choose a saint just because, you know, the indigenous community celebrated on a certain date. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the data we use, both for festival dates and for the planting and harvest dates. And so what we did here first is we assembled this data on these festivals across Mexico. A lot of it came from the Encyclopedia of Municipalities in Mexico, but it was missing a considerable amount of municipalities. So we supplemented it by directly contacting the municipality in most cases, or doing a lot of online searching. And so to avoid endogeneity concerns, what we do is we find what saint is celebrated in each municipality, and then use the official celebration date prescribed by the Vatican. The idea here is that it's possible for municipalities to kind of depart from the official date, and that's somewhat more endogenous. So we're just going to, you know, use the Vatican date to avoid some of these concerns. The primary analysis will focus on the New Spain region of Mexico, because this is the region that was first conquered by the Spanish, and it was the main administrative unit during the early colonial history. But we show results for all of Mexico for robustness. But this New Spain area is kind of nice because it simplifies the analysis, where places all kind of cultivated the same crop, which is maize. So maize was the main staple crop at the time, which is really important. It also has a very similar climate across space, making it somewhat more comparable. And the municipalities all are more compact, they're higher population density. So we think that the municipal festival date affects more of the municipality compared to some of the municipalities in the north where they're massive. And it's not clear that how many people are actually affected by this festival date. Again, I'll show results for all of Mexico as well. And so this is what the map looks like of saint days across New Spain and Mexico. And as you can see, it varies a lot across Mexico. The second data set we use is, you know, data on the crop planting and harvest dates. So we use data from the FAO's GUIDES project, and we focus on the planting and harvest cycle for maize, again, because it's historically the most important crop in the region. Alternatively, we also show results using the maximum calorie crop in each municipality. It turns out that maize is often the maximum crop anyways, so the results are quite similar. And so this is what it looks like for New Spain, kind of what is the optimal planting month and how long does it take to grow maize in each of these places to determine the harvest month. And so we construct measures of how much does the festival overlap with planting or with harvest. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the empirical strategy and some concerns here and how we address them. So what we're interested in is examining the impacts of agriculturally coinciding festivals on economic development. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm very sorry, Eliana has a question and she might not be here for the Q&A session in the end. So I let her ask her question before you jump to the identification, please.
Awesome, yeah.
Sorry, it wasn't really so crucial, but actually there's two. One is this issue of migration, because my experience of contemporary festivals, which I admit is from Sicily, is that a lot of the people who migrated away from the community come back for that day, and they are expected to give big donations. So I was wondering whether you know, these might actually channel resources back to the community, and that's one reason for survival. But the other is, I don't know if you're going to separate planting and harvesting, but it strikes me that the cash on hand would differ. So in terms of crowding out labor time, maybe they're similar, but in terms of, so if that plan of what you will show, don't address it at all.
No, those are awesome questions. The migration thing is a really good point. So we were thinking about it also in terms of like tourism from neighboring municipalities coming in, and that could be another channel that this could like lead to more economic development. It would kind of work in the favor, likely, of increasing economic development. And so that's something, it's like an empirical question, and we don't really see that that's happening. We looked a little bit at like remittances, and we don't see that they receive more remittances or things like that. But I do think that's something we need to do a bit more on, because it does bring resources in as well. So it's not just the community using resources themselves, it could also bring resources, and that could be good for economic development. We don't really see that on net. It's enough to kind of counteract this crowding out that we're seeing on investments. But that's a really good question. And then on the second question, I can talk about this on the next slide, but basically we do look at the effects separately between planting and harvest. And the effect sizes are very similar. We can never really like, statistically show that they're different. And so we just consider them as somewhat the same, but that could just be like, they're not super precisely estimated, because you're right, we would expect the effects to potentially be even larger in planting. The point estimates are a bit larger for planting, but not enough for us to be like, oh, they're different, if that makes sense. But that's a really good question that I can talk about a little bit more in a second. Okay, so the main kind of independent variable of interest is whether the festival coincides with planting or harvest. And so what we do for this is an indicator variable equal to 1 if the festival occurs 0 to 30 days before planting. So by that I mean the period when you have to like plant the seeds, prepare the land, hire labor, and then once then you just let the maize grow. Or 0 to 30 days after the harvest. So what I mean by harvest is the time when the kind of maize is ready to be harvested, that period onwards. So that's when you need to hire labor and you need to decide, are you going to sell the corn or are you going to store it for later? We include state fixed effects to account for time invariant differences across states. And we also include a number of other, historical controls or geography controls. And we include a number of other fixed effects that I can talk about. I'll show you robustness, including them, sequentially. But we include things like festival month fixed effects. Perhaps having a festival in December is different than having a festival in June, so we want to control for that. Or perhaps having planting in April is different than in June for economic development. We want to control for that. And so I'll show you results with and without all these controls. And so just on the conceptual framework, what is the hypothesis here? So for economic development, we're hypothesizing that they may lead to lower economic development if there's this crowding out. The idea here is that planting and harvest months are periods where there's time-sensitive, high-return investment opportunities. So for planting in particular, households can invest in inputs like fertilizer and seeds and devote labor time to planting activities. And these are somewhat time-sensitive investments. For harvest period, you can also devote labor time to harvest activities, and that's very important. Or you can also invest in storing crops. So the idea here is delaying sale until prices are higher. And so this is something that historians talk about a lot in central Mexico, where households were often forced to sell their maize right away at the time where prices were the lowest. But if they had been able to wait a little bit longer, prices would have been higher. And so that's one of the other kind of potential time-sensitive investments that might be going on in this time period. The idea here is that if households are liquidity constrained or face behavioral constraints, these festivals may crowd out these high return but time-sensitive investments. And so the mechanism that we'll think about if we think that this is what's going on is that these coinciding festivals decrease agricultural productivity, and over many years of lower agricultural productivity, this can reduce structural transformation and perhaps economic development in the longer run. However, there's the alternative that we'll also think about. The literature has highlighted that these kind of costly religious festivals may be positive for social capital, in particular because they're kind of effective signals of religious commitment, and this can raise religious participation. And so the idea here is that can lead to more religiosity and social capital, which might ultimately be good for economic development. And so this is an alternative, and we'll explore this as well. We'll find more evidence for the previous conceptual mechanism rather than this one, but this is an important one to also explore. And so what are the main identification concerns? So the idea here, we're assuming that if the municipality's festival date overlaps with planting or harvest, is pretty independent of other features of the municipality that might also affect economic development. The idea here is kind of the timing and whether they overlap is exogenous, is kind of the assumption. But this is a different assumption than assuming that just festival dates are completely exogenous. So it's a bit different. You maybe could plausibly argue that, but here we're just taking it a step further, and it's really about kind of the overlap of these two things. Is that exogenous or not? Of course, there's still many concerns. One important one is, for example, there's like the idea of strategic placement. So festivals may have been strategically chosen to avoid planting or harvest in some places or not others, right? The second concern, though, is that municipalities that have these coinciding festivals might just be very different on other dimensions that also affect economic development. So what we do is we conduct 2 tests to explore both of these concerns. And so first, we think about the strategic choice concern. So what we do is look at, is the planting or harvest month more likely to be coincided with the festival date or not, right? And so we include controls for state fixed effects, but importantly, calendar date fixed effects. The idea here is that if you look at the Vatican calendar, it's not uniform. So not every day has one saint. There's some dates that have a lot of saints, some that don't. So we want to kind of try to control for that. And so what we find is that controlling for kind of the popularity of a saint in the Vatican calendar, there's not evidence that these festivals are more or less likely to coincide with planting or harvest months, kind of suggesting that there isn't this kind of strategic placement going on. We think this is pretty consistent with the historical evidence that the Spanish kind of determined these festival dates at a time when they didn't kind of understand the local context very well. They just set something that they thought was appropriate. The second concern, you can think about it as balance, is that municipalities may just differ on other characteristics, even if they have agriculturally coinciding festivals. So what we do is we look at our main estimating equation, but looking at a number of other outcomes such as geographic characteristics, maze suitability, historic characteristics that we think might also matter for long-run development. And so here we're showing you kind of the estimated coefficient for a number of municipality characteristics. So thinking about things like rainfall, temperature, land suitability, maze suitability, etc. We don't really find, a statistically significant relationship, but also importantly, the point estimates are all pretty small for these municipality characteristics. So this suggests to us that it seems plausible that the timing is kind of not associated with other things that might matter for economic development. Okay, so now let me go through some of our main results here. What we do to look at long-run development is use data from the 2010 Mexico population census and focus on 2 main outcomes. It's unclear how you measure kind of economic development broadly, so we kind of want to take a step back and think about multiple ways to measure this. So the first is just using household income. Now you might think though that misses a lot of other things. So we also construct this index of economic development using a number of other questions in the census related to economic development, such as things like literacy, unemployment, schooling, asset ownership, etc. And we use kind of the first principal component of this measure. So I'll show you the results for both these measures. So first, turning to log household incomes, we see that festivals that coincide with maize planting or harvest are associated with lower economic developments. And so each column is including kind of these fixed effects sequentially and these other controls. The point estimates don't change drastically. I think the most important one are these state fixed effects that capture a lot of variation. But overall, we see this pattern that these festivals that coincide with harvesting or planting are associated with lower economic development. We find some similar patterns for when we look at this index of economic development, thinking about economic development broadly. And we can look at the effects for each of the index components. So here is log income, here's the index, and here are a number of other things that matter. So not all of these point estimates are negative and significant, which is to be expected, but we see a number of things are negative, such as like the literacy rates in these places, the years of education, how many people are employed, kind of suggesting that it's not just about incomes per se, it's about kind of broader economic development being a bit lower in these places. Another thing that we do is we can take advantage even further of kind of the timing of the festivals and look at festivals that overlap with other time periods to see like is this overlap that we're looking at between planting and harvest kind of the most important overlap, or is it just in general having festivals around these time periods is bad? So here we're looking at the festival timing relative to planting or harvest So looking at 60 to 30 days prior, 30 days prior, et cetera, and afterwards. And what we find is a pattern pretty consistent with these periods being very key. So at the top panel is looking at planting. So festivals relative to planting dates. We see that festivals prior to planting way in advance aren't associated with lower economic development, but right before planting, they are associated with lower development. And then afterwards, we don't really see an effect. And we see something similar with harvest festivals, which is that they really matter after the harvest. Kind of these time periods where there are these time-sensitive investments. And so, like I said, we also conduct a number of extensions and robustness tests. We show the results for all of Mexico and find similar patterns. We show that the results hold if we look at other crops, not just maize. So looking at what's the maximum calorie crop, looking at the planting and harvest for that, and then looking at the effects on economic development, find similar results. And also we do a few placebo tests, kind of randomly assigning festivals and seeing how our effects compare. And we find that our effects are more negative than these placebo festivals. Okay, but now let me talk about mechanisms, because I think this is perhaps a bit more important, which is why would these festivals affect economic development in the longer run? And this is kind of important because if we understand these mechanisms, we can think about what are policies we can do to, how can we design policies in places that have these festivals or not? Should we, provide liquidity in these time periods or not? And do governments do that? I'll talk about that later. And so we hypothesize that these impacts emerge because these festivals are crowding out these high return but time-sensitive investments. So the mechanism here is that these festivals that coincide with agricultural periods reduce agricultural productivity, and this has compounding effects, making it harder for localities to move away from agriculture and invest in and move into sectors like services and manufacturing. And that ultimately leads to lower economic development. And so to explore this, we use microdata from the IPM's population census and maize yield data from the CEPR. And so when we look at looking at agricultural productivity, kind of the first link in this causal process, we find that these festivals are associated with lower maize yields today, pretty considerable effects, suggesting that they do lead to lower agricultural productivity, potentially because they're crowding out some of these investments. Then when we look at, industry employment in different sectors as a proxy for structural transformation, we find that these places are more engaged in agriculture today, and they're less likely to be in services, suggesting that there's been less structural transformation of the economy historically. The other thing we do is we don't have historical measures of economic development across time for Mexico, but a lot of other economists have used things like population density as a proxy for economic development. So we use data from Sellers and Alex Garcia that has information on the population density across municipalities over time. And so what we can see is that in 1570 and 1650, so early in the colonial process, these festivals weren't really associated with lower economic development, but that afterwards, sometime between 1650 and 1900, and then 2010, they did lead to this slow decrease in economic development. Kind of this idea, we think this is consistent with this idea of these small but compounding effects over time. And so now let's think about, why do these festivals persist? What are their impacts on other things that we might care about, such as religiosity and social capital and inequality? And so what we do for this is we use data from the Americas Barometer, which has questions on religious views and participation in different groups. So first we start off creating this index of religiosity, using questions on how important is religion to an individual's life, how frequently do they attend church, are they part of religious groups or not. We also use these questions on memberships in groups to construct a proxy for social capital. So this has questions on, do you participate in community groups, things of that sort, parental groups, things like that. And so what do we find here? Here we're looking at, column 1 is looking at this religiosity index. Column 2 is looking at the group membership index, so proxying for social capital in a municipality. And then the third one is this proxy for inequality, so the interquartile range of earned incomes. So what do we find? Looking at column 1 first, we find that these coinciding festivals lead to higher religiosity. We also find in column 2 that they lead to higher group membership. So we think of this as kind of a proxy for social capital. And then finally, they're also associated with lower income inequality, consistent with what anthropologists have talked about, that there's a bit of this equity efficiency trade-off for festivals. They might be bad for economic development, but they increase equity and they also increase things like social cohesion potentially. And here we're just looking at the index components for these measures. And interestingly, just to show it, is community improvement groups are the one that's really driving the effect for the social capital, which is a pretty good proxy for social capital, we think, but it's just an interesting, sub finding there. Okay, so what are we finding here? We're finding some evidence that these coinciding festivals lead to lower economic development, potentially through their negative impacts on the agricultural sector. So the idea here is that these festivals lead to lower agricultural productivity. That decreases structural transformation over time, which leads to less economic development. But we're also finding that they seem to be associated with higher religiosity and social capital, consistent with this potential trade-off that people have highlighted. However, the impacts on social capital aren't enough to negate the negative impacts through agriculture, but they may help explain why these coinciding festivals continue to persist today. They make people feel more religious, more cohesive, and they want to keep celebrating them for this reason, which makes a lot of sense. Okay, so what do we find in this paper? We created this data set of festival dates across Mexico, and we're using variation in the timing of festivals and agricultural seasons to show that coinciding festivals that coincide with planting or harvest periods lead to worse development outcomes in the long run. They reduce agricultural productivity and structural transformation due to this crowding out in the agricultural sector, but they're also associated with higher religious social capital and equity, perhaps explaining why these festivals tend to persist today. And we also think we provide some insights into the development policies that we see across the world. So in Catholic countries, you see a specific institution, which is this withholding and paying a 13th salary in December. This is a time period where people are spending money on these religious festivals like Christmas or other festivals around this time period. And so actually a lot of governments realize this, and then they withhold money in this time period where people might be liquidity constrained, and then give them the 13th salary then. And so we think that there's kind of potential, if you understand these religious festivals in different settings, you could design policies a bit differently to provide liquidity around these time periods, potentially. So yeah, thank you. That's what I have today. And so we really appreciate any comments and feedbacks. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. I guess Sonia has a question for you.
Hi, it was a really interesting paper. Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask if maybe I didn't understand the setup fully. The question of why agricultural timing matters. I wanted to ask if when the festival is not coincident with harvest planting seasons, as it's a major planned commitment, wouldn't you expect people to save? Then I saw results for labor, and I can see that labor allocation is time sensitive, but to the extent that it's allocation of money, are you assuming they don't save?
No, we're assuming that that's a really good question. We're not assuming that they don't save. It's just that there's kind of constraints on what savings mechanisms are available for people, like poor people in rural areas. And I think we know that people face kind of constraints on how much they can save. It could be behavioral too, the discounting and decide to spend money on the festival instead of, on these longer run payoff things. Could be that. But it could also be just imperfect credit markets don't allow people to save, especially historically. So it could be both those things. And I think they probably are saving. We're not saying that they're not saving, but just like people in the US probably don't save enough for retirement, even though it's an anticipated expenditure. It's something like that is happening. Even if it's known, it's true people should save, but we know people aren't always great at that, even when credit markets are perfectly functioning. So I think that it's both of these mechanisms.
Okay, thanks. I did write something else in chat, but I think other people should ask, and it's just a sort of speculative remark. If nobody says anything else, I can ask it.
We have time, Sonia, so please, if you want to share your other thought, please go ahead. We have time.
Okay. So you had this association right at the end between the festival coinciding with this time, with these sensitive agricultural periods and religiosity. And I wanted you to reflect on the possibility that people feel religious because in their minds there's an association between the festival, the saint, religiosity, and good times, such as the plentiful time after a harvest.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. No, thank you. So I think my answer is going to be a bit more speculative on that too. But I do think something we've been reading about is that a lot of countries, even in Europe, for example, have harvest time festivals. And so we're showing that those festivals might not be great for economic development, but they are particularly good for, celebrations when things are plentiful. And so I think it makes sense, like right after harvest, you might feel like there's a lot, you have more money, you all of a sudden have more things, and then people celebrate. And I think that's a good thing for people, and they like that. I think it's similar to what you see after people get paid at the end of the month. There's often people go out and celebrate. There's these times of plentifulness, and I think that's really good for things like social capital and cohesion and things like that. Even as like if you take a purely like what's efficient, it might not be optimal, but I think it kind of explains why a lot of places have these harvest festivals. I think like parts of Europe have harvest festivals, for example, and I think that might be the case, might be why. But that's speculative. We don't prove that, but I think you raise a very interesting point for sure.
I have also a comment, Eduardo. Did you try to do some heterogeneity by religiosity? I have in mind the paper of Paul Seabright on God ensures those who pay, right? And I wonder one explanation could be that when people pay to God, somehow they exert less effort into their agricultural productive labor for God rewards.
That's interesting. That's super interesting. We haven't done that. So I just wrote down something quickly because I think what you suggest actually just in terms of heterogeneity would be interesting. Like thinking about things like, are there more? So that paper is a bit about insurance. So we could look at heterogeneity, like, is there, are there good insurance mechanisms or banking sectors there? In places that have better banks, do we find different effects? I think we haven't done enough on that. It'd be interesting though to do more micro, asking people like, if you have a planting festival, does that mean that you think you're going to be able to have a better harvest season? My sense is that people do think that. I don't know how big an effect that is, but we should definitely think about that. Yeah,
but also looking at heterogeneity by your religiosity index, right? Because and I also wonder whether you could have some data to create outcomes as in Nathan's and Paola Giuliano papers to capture measures of traditionalism.
Oh, that's a really good idea. I'll have to look into that. I think one constraint with looking at things like within Mexico is that the survey data on like cultural outcomes is a bit more limited, but I'll look into that because that is very interesting. I think there is world value surveys for Mexico, but they're very small. There's only like 1,000 people each wave. But I'll definitely look into that because you're right. Like
this could explain the negative effect on the development, right? Being more traditional.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And perhaps these places that are more religious, they're also more traditionalists, and that would make a lot of sense too. That's another really good suggestion. So.
Yeah, and also a naive question, but did you try to work on nightlight outcomes as well as another proxy of development?
No, we haven't done that, but that would be a natural thing we could look at. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Actually, someone suggested this. Yeah, like there's other good satellite measure data that we could think about using as well, but we haven't done that very much.
Thanks, Eduardo, for a great, fantastic paper. I was really intrigued by this finding you showed towards the end on the effects on social cohesion and religiosity. And I was wondering if you had any information from the America's Barometer survey on things like attitudes toward gender norms or prejudice against LGBTQ plus people. Like, I'm just thinking about potential negative consequences this may have. As well.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. I think there might be a little bit on that, and we should look on that, because it's true that Catholicism has very strict norms on these things, and so if you're more, tied, like as Jordan was saying, to these traditional norms, perhaps that's led to like a slower change in norms for these things. And I think that would be really interesting. We haven't really explored that. Because on that, Mexico is particularly interesting. Like the urban areas have very different norms than areas in rural areas,
Right.
on these things, and we haven't really explored that. So yeah, we'll think about that.
That would be very
sure.
interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, let me write that down too.
So if there are no other questions, I suggest we have a break. So we are 15 minutes earlier than expected. So it means that we should have a longer break. Meanwhile, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to send some mails or to put them in the chat and to Eduardo. So what is foreseen in the program is that Nathan will present his paper at 4:15, Paris time. So this means that like in half an hour. And then we will have Sonia presenting his paper as our last but not least speaker. So I suggest we have a break and we gather again in half an hour. Thank you so much.